want you to look around the room. It's a packed house. Can't imagine that has anything to do with the extra hour of sleep you got this morning. I have been asked by some of the people who do the ushering if you could move in a little bit. We've had a couple of people leave and not come to church because there wasn't room during worship for them to come in. So if you can just make space, that would be super helpful for the people coming in now. And it is just so good to see all of you here this morning. Look at all of you, bright and shiny. Lots of rest, well rested. Give yourself a round of applause. You made it. Those who are live streaming right now feel extra bad. They have no excuses. Tired doesn't cut it. Good morning. For those of you who know me well, you know that I love to read. I have not, however, always loved to read. I fell in love with reading somewhere between junior and senior year of high school. My junior year was a profoundly transformative year for me. It began like any other school year, mostly in trouble, mostly not interested in school. But by the end of that year, through the efforts of a few really special teachers, I discovered how much I love academics. And at the end of that year, actually, one of those special teachers recommended me for advanced placement in several courses, one of which was English, AP English, as we sometimes often say. And because it was an AP class, the standards, of course, are much higher, the workload much greater. And that was made clear when one of the teachers, the English teacher for the senior year, assigned not one, but 2 books to be read before the first day of class. Oh, I was initially not thrilled at all by this decision. I thought, what have I gotten myself into? But I soon discovered how much I actually love to read. I love literature. Or let me clarify, I love well-written literature. There is a difference. One of the books that we read was titled The Stranger by the French existentialist Albert Camus. Not the most uplifting book, but the other book was quite uplifting. One of my favorites, one of the best-selling books of all time, a book called A Tale of Two Cities, written by perhaps one of the best authors of all time in Charles Dickens. The book begins, of course, with one of the more iconic lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Yes, the book was first published in 1859, and the story revolves around several characters. Charles Darnay, his wife, Lucy Manette, daughter of Dr. Manette, and Sidney Carton. The story takes place during the French Revolution, which is the backdrop of the whole narrative. And it's called A Tale of Two Cities because Dickens uses these cities to highlight contrasting ideals or values. He uses Paris and London to highlight these opposite virtues, these opposite values. Paris in the story is in the throes of revolution. It's a place of chaos and unpredictability and anger and vengeance and ultimately injustice and death. London, on the other hand, it's a place of peace and stability. It represents love and loyalty and justice and personal sacrifice. And Dickens uses these two cities rather brilliantly, I might add, to highlight the choice that everyone has between love and betrayal, between sacrifice and self-interest. The story is absolutely worthy of your attention. And just for what it's worth, I think everyone should read good literature. It's good for you. Charles Dickens is one of the best at writing it. A Tale of Two Cities is a beautiful story, but it's also not an original story either. The contrasts of love and betrayal, life and death, sacrifice and self-interest, they can be traced all the way back to the first century in a tale not of two cities, but of two disciples of Jesus Christ. One who chooses injustice and self-interest and death, much like Paris represents, and the other who chooses love and loyalty and sacrifice, much like London represents. And it's a tale that we find in our text this morning in Mark chapter 14. If you have your Bibles, open them to Mark 14. This morning we continue in our verse-by-verse study of Mark's gospel. And chapter 14 is really where things begin to escalate pretty quickly. Up to this point, we began Mark's study, by the way, now 13 months ago. We started on the first Sunday of October 2023. It is now the first Sunday of November 2024. And in chapter 14, this is where things really begin to pick up. Things have been kind of moving, I think, at a normal pace. But chapter 14 is where things really start to get spicy. Now, before we jump in, I want to recap for those of you who are guests with us this morning. Welcome, glad you're here. For those of you who haven't been here in a while, welcome back, slackers, good to have you. Remember, the final week of Jesus' life, earthly life at least, begins in chapter 11 in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We refer to this week now, this final week of the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ, as Holy Week, beginning with Palm Sunday and culminating in Resurrection Sunday. Chapter 11 begins on Palm Sunday as Jesus enters into the city of Jerusalem. Remember, he's riding the donkey. The people are shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming of the kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." It's a beautiful passage, Mark 11, 9 and 10. The next day, Monday, Jesus returns to Jerusalem, and it's on the way to Jerusalem. Remember, Jesus curses the fig tree, and he makes his way to the temple, and then he overturns the tables of the money changers, and he rebukes the temple officials. And then Tuesday comes around, and Jesus and his disciples go back again to the temple from the city where they were staying on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And on their way, remember, they notice that same fig tree that Jesus cursed, and it has withered, signifying the eventual destruction of the temple, which happened, of course, in 70 AD. And upon arriving at the temple, Jesus is confronted by the Sanhedrin, the most powerful religious Jewish group in Jerusalem. And then he is met after that with various confrontations, first from the Pharisees and the Herodians, and then the Sadducees, and then finally a scribe. And after silencing all of these various groups, he moves to the place where the scrolls would be unfurled in the temple and there would be teaching. And he teaches on the relationship between King David and this future messianic figure, of course, which he points to himself as the fulfillment of. And after teaching, he and his disciples, it says they leave, they go outside of the temple and across the way, and they sit down on a place called the Mount of Olives. And it's there that Jesus has the longest teaching discourse in Mark's Gospel, chapter 13, and what we call the Olivet Discourse. And he talks about not only the signs that are going to precede the destruction of the temple, but this future second coming when the Son of Man from Daniel 7 comes on the clouds and judges the nations, which of course we spent the last month studying in our Apocalypse mini-series. And that brings us then to chapter 14. Verses 1 and 2 is where we pick up in this story. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." Okay, so remember, beginning chapter 11, Sunday, and then we get to Monday, and then we get to Tuesday. Now, in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14, we're told that it is 2 days prior to both the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Everyone clear about what that means? Good, let's keep moving. What in the world is the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread? I want you to take a note, circle, highlight, do whatever it is you do in your Bible or in your journal if you're a note taker. These are both especially important Jewish religious holidays that we are going to examine in greater detail next week. Because really, I think next week's text fits contextually better to spend some time on both of these festivals. They play a pretty significant role in understanding what Jesus is doing in next week's passage, which is incidentally the institution of the Lord's Supper. Now, with that being said, let me dispel some things this morning that may upset you. Sorry, not sorry. We are not taking communion today. Normally we would. This is first Sunday of the month, normally Communion Sunday. However, given that next week's passage is where this whole practice is instituted, I felt it would be a lot more special if we pushed it to next week and we did it concurrently with the passage where we find sort of the origin story for it. So for now, just understand that the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they're deeply significant Jewish holidays. They foreshadow the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord. So it's now 2 days prior to the Passover, which means it is Wednesday. And I will explain why that is the case again next week when we talk about time and calendar and all of that. After being embarrassed over and over again by Jesus in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes, they've had enough. They are now set on killing this man. But remember, this is not the first time a plan like this has been discussed. This plan to destroy Jesus goes all the way back to chapter 3 during Jesus' Galilean portion of his ministry. Mark chapter 3, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand. And it says in verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. That was a couple of years ago at this point. I mean, Jesus' earthly ministry is about 3.5 years. The Galilean portion was right at the very beginning of that time, right after his baptism. So understand that now, in chapter 14, Jesus has gained a lot more notoriety. After leaving Galilee, he did a lot of ministry between then and now. He went north of the Sea of Galilee into the regions of Tyre and Sidon and Caesarea Philippi. He traveled east of the Sea of Galilee into the Gentile-populated area of the Decapolis. He eventually made his way south of the Sea of Galilee into the regions of Samaria and Perea across the Jordan before finally entering into Jerusalem in chapter 11. So a lot of things have transpired since chapter 3. In chapter 3, when they wanted to destroy him, he wasn't as well known. He had some popularity in Galilee, but beyond that, wasn't as well known. Now, in chapter 14, he's extremely well known. He's definitely a much larger threat to the religious elites. And so they've discussed this plan to destroy him a lot at this point. You don't see it as clearly in the English. In the Greek, that phrase, they were seeking to arrest him, is in the imperfect tense, indicating that this is a repeated action in the past. In other words, they were continually seeking to arrest and kill Jesus. And they would have sooner done it had not there been an uproar, or fear rather, of an uproar from the people. One interpretive question is, which people? Who are they concerned about? Which people are a threat to them? Verse 2 clarifies the answer for us. It says, not during the festival. So again, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread play a role here. The Passover more than anything else. The Passover is, in conjunction with being one of the most important religious holidays, it's one of the 3 pilgrimages that are prescribed to Jewish males in particular, meaning that at some point in your life, regardless of where you lived in the world, you needed to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to observe the Passover in the holy city. So keep in mind that people were traveling from all over the world into the holy city during this time. There were a much higher number of people in the city during this time, in other words. And think about this for a moment. We're going to have, I think, some round of the World Cup next year, 2 years from now. I can never keep up with the dates. I'm an American, right? We don't watch soccer, we watch football. And we complain about it as Cowboys fans. Imagine for a moment, though, that if the World Cup final came to Jerry World, people from all over the world come for this one event. What happens to the city when something like that occurs? Traffic gets infinitely worse. How that's possible, I don't know, because it's already very bad. But it gets worse. Restaurants become overly crowded. There's way more attention on Dallas because no one gets Arlington right. This is what's happening in Jerusalem. The chief priests want to put Jesus to death, but he had become so popular as a miracle worker and a prophet who had gone from city to city performing miracles, and now many of those people from those cities were in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. This is the issue. We can't kill him during the Passover, not because it's wrong, not because it violates the scripture, not because we're wrestling with the morality of it. We don't care about any of that. We just really care about what people might think. This isn't godly reverence. This is the fear of man. Now, while their plan to execute the Lord is being worked out, Mark inserts a tale of 2 disciples. Read verses 3 through 5. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment and of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her for it. Okay, so let's unpack this. First of all, where are they? They're in the city of Bethany, which is approximately 2 miles from Jerusalem on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. This is the city, by the way, where Jesus and his disciples have been staying for the entirety of Holy Week. This is not the first time we've come across the city of Bethany. We've mentioned this in chapter 11, actually. Every day when Jesus makes his way to the temple in Jerusalem, he's making a journey from Bethany to the city of Jerusalem where all of these things are unfolding. That whole fig tree incident where he curses it and it withers and dies, that happens on a path between the city of Bethany and the city of Jerusalem. So he's been staying in Bethany in between each of these temple episodes. Up to this point, we have not been told precisely where in Bethany he's been staying, just that him and his disciples were staying there. But Mark tells us in verse 3 that it was actually in the house of Simon the leper. Now, who is this? We don't know much about him, but as good evangelicals, we can speculate. We don't know much about him from the text. We know that he was a leper, one that Jesus likely had healed. It would not make sense if he were still a leper at this point, given the interaction between him and the disciples as well. But it is very likely that Jesus healed him, and this is how they came into contact and community with him and were able to stay with him in his home. It's also interesting that when we analyze other historical documents, we find that very close in proximity to the city of Bethany was a leper colony. So in the 1940s, scholars discovered a cave in Qumran. The Qumran scrolls is how we talk about them today, of Old Testament artifacts. In addition to Old Testament, we get a number of temple scrolls that would have been used in the temple during the Second Temple Judaism portion of history that give kind of a better idea of what was going on in Judaism during this time. In Temple Scroll 11 of Qumran, it says, "You shall make 3 places to the east of the city, separated from one another, to which shall come the lepers and those afflicted with discharge." So apparently, there was a place near Jerusalem to the east, which is also where Bethany is, full of lepers, a leper colony, as it were. Now, think for a moment about the Bible, not in Mark, but in other places. Who else do we know in the gospel stories that are connected closely to the city of Bethany? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Remember them? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So it's possible, follow me here for a moment, I'm going to make a case, that Simon the leper might actually be the father of, or at least a close relative to, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Now that may seem like a stretch, but let me make the case from John's gospel. Consider John's account of this same story. Mark is not the only one who records the story of a woman pouring out ointment on Jesus and anointing him. John's account includes it as well, and he includes details that Mark leaves out in his story. So if you want to place Mark 14 for a moment and turn to John chapter 12, we'll walk through John's account of it and see if we can put some of these details together to get a fuller picture of the story. Now, as you are turning there, let me talk a little bit about the context from John 11, because it does play a role in how we understand this story. If you're not familiar with it, Mary and Martha send word to Jesus that Lazarus, their brother, has fallen ill and would likely die barring a miracle. And so Jesus, a well-known miracle worker, seems like their best bet at preventing him from dying. And John 11 tells us that upon receiving this message, Jesus waits intentionally several days before going to Bethany to ensure that Lazarus will die. It seems like a very shocking detail, especially considering Jesus' love for Lazarus. John 11:5 says Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He loves this family. We don't even know how he knows this family, but we know he loves them. So it's a strange detail for Jesus to let Lazarus intentionally die until you figure out that he does this so that he can demonstrate his power over death by raising Lazarus from the dead, which he eventually does. It's an amazing story. If you're not familiar with John 11, it's one of my favorite accounts. And then we get to chapter 12, and we get John's account of the same story in Mark 14. John 12, verses 1 and 2 says this: 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And so they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Now, pause for a moment, real fast. You'll notice some of you who are privy to numbers and time, what seems like a contradiction in time between the two stories. Mark's gospel says that this is taking place 2 days prior to the Passover. John starts his with 6 days prior to the Passover. Now, what in the world? How can these be the same story? I thought the Bible was perfect and infallible. How do we get opposite details? Well, notice that what John says actually is not contradictory at all. It says that Jesus arrived 6 days before the Passover, not necessarily that the dinner took place 6 days before the Passover. In other words, John is saying that Jesus arrived in Bethany 6 days prior to the Passover, which would have been the Saturday before Palm Sunday. So he comes into town, he raises Lazarus from the dead on the Sabbath, no less, and then goes into the temple on Sunday riding on the donkey beginning Holy Week on Palm Sunday. This is consistent with Mark's gospel account. The dinner happens in John's account at a later unspecified time, which we know from Mark happened 2 days prior to the Passover. But keep reading as we get more details. Look at verse 3. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Okay, so we learn then the identity of the unnamed woman in Mark 14 as well. Mark never gives us her name, but John indicates that it was none other than Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And if we're okay with conjecture, maybe the daughter or at least relative of Simon the leper. And John, like Mark, says that she anointed Jesus with this entire flask of this very expensive ointment worth a lot of money. Both John and Mark say that it was worth more than 300 denarii. Given that we know that a denarius, a single denarius, was worth a day's wage, this means that this ointment was roughly a year's worth of wages. Think expensive, like from Macy's cologne or perfume. Right? I did a search this week. I was just curious, like, what's the most expensive cologne? There are colognes worth $1 million, $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. Like, if you're buying $900,000 cologne, stop, you need to give your money to the poor. You've won the game. You have too much money. You're doing mindless things now, right? There's no reason for this. We have a gym to remodel. Come and be a member at City on a Hill. Fund it. We'll even name it after you. This is an enormous sacrifice that Mary is making here. But keep reading. Verses 4 and 5 tell us even more. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" So Mark, in his account in verse 4, says there were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this wasted?" But John says that this whole thing was stirred up by Judas. Now, Judas is often seen as, and rightly so, the enemy, but he seems like a pretty good guy here. I mean, he's a real humanitarian with a heart for poor people. You know, he sees expensive ointment being poured out, and he thinks, we could have bought a lot of groceries for the poor. If we had just sold that, we could have filled the shelves at the local homeless shelter. He's not wrong, right? At least until you get to verse 6. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Bum, bum, bum. Judas saw this expensive ointment being poured out. He didn't think about the poor for a second. He thought about all the cool things that he could purchase had they just sold that ointment and made money off it and put it in the money bag, the same money bag he was robbing. Okay, so now come back to Mark 14. What do we know now from reading John's account of this same story? We know that Simon the leper was a man that Jesus healed, likely started a relationship with him and his family as a result of that healing, was possibly the father or at bare minimum a head of household for Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We know that Jesus was reclining at the table in this home with Lazarus. We know that the woman who was anointing Jesus with the ointment was Mary, and we know that the one who was upset about the whole thing was Judas. Mary and Judas, a tale of two disciples, one who chooses love and loyalty and sacrifice, one who chooses self-interest, betrayal, and death. which is exactly what Mark unfolds for us in the next verses. Look at verses 6 through 9. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." I just want to pause here and point out that verse 9 is being fulfilled right now. 2,000 years later, in the opposite side of the world, in a different language and in a different culture, she is being remembered for this as we open God's word. Judas stirs up the room by saying, "We could have sold that and used the money to serve the poor." And Jesus says, "You can always serve the poor, but you will not always have me." Why does he say that? Because he knows he's about to die. The death of Jesus Christ is not a surprise to Jesus. His life is not something that is taken from him. We know from John chapter 10, what does Jesus say? "I have the authority to lay my life down that I might take it up again. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down that I might take it back up again." He has the authority to do that. That's why he says in verse 8, "She's anointed my body beforehand for burial." See, the Jewish people, they didn't embalm their dead like the Egyptians did. There was obviously a quite tumultuous relationship between Israel and Egypt given the events of Exodus. But they did anoint their dead with spices to cover the smell of death. And so Jesus is saying, she's preparing me for death. The one disciple, Mary, chooses love and loyalty for her Lord. She chooses sacrifice by pouring out an immensely costly ointment on Jesus to express her honor and devotion and worship for him. The other disciple, in contrast, is only concerned with himself. Judas doesn't care about the poor. He doesn't care about the ointment. He doesn't care about the Lord. He only cares about Judas. He chooses self-interest in place of sacrifice. Instead of love and loyalty, he betrays his friend and he turns him over to injustice and death, which is how this passage ends. Look at verses 10 and 11. "And then Judas, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him." Judas didn't get the money by selling the ointment. So what did he do instead? He sold out the Lord. He betrayed Jesus Christ, God incarnate, for a bag of money. Mark 14, 1 through 11 is a tale of two disciples. Two disciples that embody distinctly opposite value. For Mary, it was the best of times. She loved Jesus. She was devoted to Jesus. She would sacrifice the most valuable things she had to express her devotion to Jesus. For Judas, it was the worst of times. He had only his own interest in mind. He only cared for himself, and he ultimately betrayed his friend and condemned him to death just to satisfy his own desires. Charles Dickens ripped off the Bible, didn't he? Oh my gosh. He didn't think we'd notice, but we did. How does this passage apply to us today? I never want to leave you without a takeaway or two from the scriptures. So let me give you just a few takeaways that I think come right out of the text this morning. Here's the first one. My words express what I think I value, but my actions express what I actually value. One of the things that I hope becomes clear in Mark 14, 1 through 11, is that actions mean more than words. Judas is literally one of the 12. He's followed Jesus everywhere. He's been a part of every major ministry moment, barring the couple of instances with only Peter, James, and John. He's been there. He's witnessed the miracles. He's done ministry with Jesus. I mean, he left his home and followed him for years. He's the guy that says, Jesus is my Lord. I love Jesus. I serve Jesus. I left everything to go follow him. I value him. And yet, in the end, his actions tell a different story. He says he loves Jesus, and then he betrays him. His words indicate that he loves the Lord. His actions indicate that he loves himself. He may have done a lot of great things, but man, when the pressure was turned up, he betrays God for a bag of money. Listen to me. It is so easy to convince yourself that you're the real deal. It really is. It's so easy to convince yourself that you're a Christian. You live in the Bible Belt, for crying out loud. It's practically popular still. It's getting less popular, but not as bad as, Portland or Washington, where heathens live. New York. It's so easy to do this. It's so easy to say, I'm a believer. I love my church. I come once or twice a month. I believe in God. I even pray, especially when my football team is losing or before dinner time or whatever. It's easy to say you love the Lord, but what do your actions say about your love for Jesus Christ? When the pressure gets turned up, who do you serve? Not who do you say you serve. Who do you actually serve? What does your life say about that? If we were watching your life with no dialogue, a silent film, what would we take away from it concerning your love for Jesus Christ? Who gets your priority, or your time, your money? I want you to wrestle with this. I don't want you to float through life thinking you're more like Mary when in actuality you're more like Judas. I'd rather make you uncomfortable now and you work through this than get to the end of your life and be massively uncomfortable by the fact that you bought a lie. Here's the second takeaway. The love of money is truly the root of all evil. These are not even my words. This is what God says. 1 Timothy 6:10, one of the most misquoted Bible verses of all time. Usually people will say money is the root of all evil. That's not what it says. It says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. But that's not even where it ends. He goes on to say, it is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Who does that sound like? 1 Timothy 6:10 is a warning of the detriment of loving money. Mark chapter 14 describes what the love of money actually looks like. Judas loves money so much, he craves it so much, he ends up wandering away from the faith and piercing himself with many griefs. And he does end up with a lot of money, by the way. He buys a field. He becomes a landowner, something that's exceedingly rare in the ancient world because of the money he gets from selling out the Lord. He ends up with a lot of money. You know what else he ends up with a lot of? Grief. So much so that he ends up taking his own life in the field that he purchased. Acts 1:18 and 19. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all of his bowels gushed out. Let me just say for a moment, Christians who have a problem with like PG-13 rated R movies, read your Bible. I'm not advocating for every rated R movie, but I'm just saying you can't make an accurate Bible movie or show without it being graphic. The Bible's graphic. This is graphic. It became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem so that the field was called in their own language, Akeldama, that is field of blood. Imagine there's field of blood. Why do we call it that, Dad? Because that's where Judas killed himself. Violently. This is what the Bible is teaching. Money itself is not a problem. It's neither positive nor negative. It's neutral. Money's not the issue. It's our insatiable love for it. The love of money will lead you to do all kinds of awful things that you never dreamed you were capable of. It will lead you to allow things to happen to yourself that you never dreamed you would allow happen. And it doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly. But if you give yourself over to it again and again, you will look back at some point in your life and think, how in the world did I get here? And before long, you'll be willing to betray your faith to satisfy your own desires. Learn the lesson from Judas. That's a valuable lesson. Here's the third one. My devotion to Jesus always takes precedence over my ministry to other people. Mary could have sold her ointment. She could have served the poor with the money that she made by selling the ointment, and it would not have been a bad thing. Judas wasn't the only one upset by this. Verse 5 says they, plural, scolded her. So while Judas stirred the pot, the others agreed, and it's understandable to a degree. The desire to sell this and use the money to help the poor is a good desire. But Mary was more concerned with her devotion to Jesus than her ministry to other people. And the Lord commended her for it. Some of you, I know, are really driven by ministering to other people. You want to serve. You want to be of help, and you should be commended for that. I think it's a virtuous thing to want to serve others. It's in many ways embodying the very characteristics that Jesus himself demonstrates in his earthly ministry. But listen to me. Make sure that it doesn't come at the cost of your personal relationship to him. If you only ever say yes to other people and you never set aside time to worship the Lord, to speak with the Lord, to express your love for the Lord, to rest in his grace and kindness, you sort of miss the forest for the trees. Some of you have never served, and you need to serve and you need to give. It's a part of the Christian life and discipline that the scriptures command us. But some of you serve too much. And you need to be told to slow down, sit down, stop serving, and rest at the feet of the Savior. You can't pour yourself out for other people if you're empty. You have to come back to the Lord and allow him to refill you that he might pour you out again and again. Now, how do we do that? By resting in his presence and worshiping him for who he is. That's one of the ways. And so that's how we're going to close our time this morning. There is no one more worthy of your heart than Jesus Christ. He is worthy of it all. Every single part of you. Every fiber of your being. From him, from his hands come all good things, and to him belongs all praise. So as we close, I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to end our time with the posture of one of these two disciples, with worship, with devotion to the Lord. And I want you now, during this time of prayer, and as we move into this time of worship, I want you to consider what valuable things do you have in your life that you need to break apart and pour out for him and devotion to him. What sacrifice do you need to make as you come to his throne to declare to him that which is true? He is worthy of it all. Pray with me. Father, we believe that Jesus Christ is worthy of everything we have. However, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing for our actions to demonstrate it. So my prayer this morning, Father, through the ministry of your Spirit, is that as we close this time in worship, that we consider the things perhaps we need to sacrifice at the foot of the cross in order to express our devotion more clearly to you. That as uncomfortable as worship may be for some people, that we express that we give up our comforts, and that with the lifting of our voices and perhaps even our hands, we ascribe to you all honor and glory and praise. Lord, we love you and we thank you in Jesus' name.